Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to look at the tracing board, or the trestle board, or some people call it the master's carpet. All terms for something that we've seen in just about every lodge. That tannish piece of paper or fabric hanging on the wall with a number of different symbols from a number of different degrees. Sometimes there are 3 of them. I can think of multiple lodges, such as Burlington or Waukesha, where some form of this piece is hanging in the lodge room. But where do they come from, and how do we transition from, well, what was initially chalk on a floor through those tracing boards and trestle boards all the way up to the modern slideshow of today? These trestle boards or tracing boards are undoubtedly a connection between the operative masonry of ages past and the speculative masonry of today. I would suggest that when we look at this subject, it's necessary to examine it under 2 headings: the original operative use in history and then the speculative use in history. So we need to start with the ancient. Where does this idea come from? What were the ancients doing? Now, there's no doubt that among the ancients, for example, the Egyptians, a tracing board of sorts was in use, as the remains of many of them have been found alongside the ruins of ancient buildings. They were ruled in squares, and the plan of the building was often drawn on a squared board. And when I say that, sometimes these actually have grid patterns, sometimes they're simply laid out in a rectangle or in a square to make sure that everything lays out properly. Each square of the board represents a certain number of bricks or cubes of stone, and the builders were thus able to get the proportions of the building right. This method was also used by sculptors, and it's used by sculptors going back to likely ancient Egypt. It's a very easy way to work. What you would do is you would put up a grid in front of the piece that you've done in clay that you're going to copy into marble or diorite in the case of the Egyptians, or whatever other stone. And then you lay the same grid, although at a different scale, across the stone. And then it's a matter of simply matching things up so that you're scaling it up properly. It's not about simplifying. It's not about, oh, in this grid, in this square, I just need this line. Really, it's about making sure the scale is appropriate. You haven't accidentally made a giant head or something like that. And you can imagine with a building, that's going to be just as important. The architect usually cut a tracing board in some form into the stone somewhere in the building or near the building. Many of these exist today. I can think of 2 examples. One is the meteorological stone from Salamis, which has on it specific measures, for example. So what is a hand? What is the length of a cubit officially? Because these measures originally were based on the human body. And of course, the human body varies quite a bit. So a hand could be a different length. So they would carve these stones frequently into one of the first courses of stones on the inside of a temple or building. And that stone would stay there until they were finished, at which point they would polish it out and completely destroy it. In this case, it was a separate stone. We also know, for example, at the Temple of Apollo at Didyma in Turkey, and this is a Hellenistic, sort of late Greek temple, that we find one of these plans, as I've discussed here, laid out with the grid, laying out what the building is supposed to look like. Because the building was never finished, they never polished it out. And so we have a great deal of information. So that's where this is starting. And this would become part of this sort of idea of the tracing board. Now, for other parts of the work, for example, they're working on a specific area, they would frequently draw on the floor usually in their workshop, which would have sand or dust or rushes or whatever else on the floor, and they would draw what they're doing. Sometimes they might do it in chalk on a convenient piece of stone or wood. But this is the tradition that we're starting with. This custom still persists in Iran today after 4,000 years. The squares are laid out on the floor, often of a workroom, and the plan of the building to be erected is marked out, and each square represents 4 bricks. So we see it continuing to this day. By the way, using grid paper is no different than what we're discussing here. So, how do we get from there to Freemasonry? Well, let's start with the tracing board. The best description of the drawing on the floor of the lodge, which I've kind of previously discussed, and I've been able to find, is an exposure from 1760. It's from a book known as Jachin and Boaz. By the way, if you listen to the Morgan Affair series, this is the same book that Miller was going to print that got him in some trouble with a local lodge in Albany. The book is also known as an authentic key to the door of Freemasonry, both ancient and modern, and it says the following. He, the candidate, is also learnt the steps or how to advance to the master upon the drawings on the floor, which in some lodges resembles the grand building, termed a mosaic palace, and is described with the utmost exactness. They also draw other figures, one of which is called the lace tuft, and the other the throne beset with stars. There is also represented a perpendicular line in the form of a mason's instrument, commonly called a plumb line. These are all explained to him in the most accurate manner, and the ornaments and emblems of the order are described with great faculty. After the symbols and emblems have been carefully explained to the candidate, he was usually given a mop and pail of water in order to wash the drawings off the floor. By the way, in many lodges, that was the tiler's job. And the tiler would be responsible for eliminating those drawings should someone come in who wasn't supposed to see them, or had someone not done so at the end of the meeting. For this reason, mops and pails are often listed in a lodge's standard inventory, even in places where you wouldn't expect it, where they're not necessarily responsible for those cleaning duties. The tedious job of having to draw the tracing board or trestle board, the term is really difficult to work with here. A lot of authors interchange them, but here it would be more a tracing board. But the job of having to draw it before every meeting with chalk and or charcoal later gave way to permanent wooden or cloth tracing boards being fixed to the floor, usually in the form of painted carpets or being something made of fabric and paper, usually paper backed with fabric and then taped or nailed or pinned to the floor. This was probably because of the need for secrecy would lessen during this period, and many lodges have obtained a more permanent location to meet rather than the local tavern. It was also better for the tavern operator or owner who, despite all the cleaning of chalk and charcoal, probably still find some stains that they're really not that keen on having to deal with, because of course the chalk and charcoal gets between the floorboards. You're going to see it. It's a problem. So here we are moving from the temporary, the ephemeral form, these drawings on the floor, to something more permanent. And when I go through the material, it appears that many authors believe that the tracing board is primarily the ephemeral form, the temporary form, and then the trestle board is the more permanent form. Now, many interchangeably use the term trestle board and tracing board, often varying by geographic region. However, the two are physically different. In the earliest days of stonemasonry, buildings and monuments, their designs would be drawn, or at least partial designs, studies really, would be drawn in the dirt of the floor, or would be drawn onto a stone or whatever else to instruct the masons on that day's work. These early tracing boards, of course, would wash away. When masonry shifts from operative to speculative, the custom will continue. During the days when masonry met secretly, of course, they're drawing in the dirt. As things change, by the late 17th century, brethren begin commissioning local artists to paint various symbols from Freemasonry and the specific degrees on canvas or cloth that can be rolled up and stowed away after every meeting. By the way, every lodge still has examples of this in the form of the winding staircase, amongst other things. So, these paintings later become commonplace displays around lodge rooms, oftentimes sitting on an easel or a trestle, hence the name a trestle board, or at times hung on the wall. No longer just a visual demonstration of that day's degree work, the tracing board, or in this case the trestle board now, if I'm following the authors correctly, becomes an emblem of the Masonic way of life. Which brings us to the master's carpet, which sometimes happens. The master's carpet is when you would actually have it embroidered into fabric or created into a rug. Now, this is an odd term or an odd idea, but it's much more common in Europe because going back to the beginning of the end of the 18th, early 19th century, one of the earliest elements of the Industrial Revolution is this invention by the French of what is basically a rudimentary computer that can put images in textiles. You see it in old chairs, for example, images of knights and princesses and everything else, and it would be on the pads of a chair. Some lodges may still have this, but it means that I could quickly and oftentimes more economically than painting them, create this trestle board in fabric and hang it on the wall or put it on the floor. And it makes sense why you would do that. Its position on the floor makes a master's carpet, but also this tradition that we see from Europe of putting it into textile would also create the idea of the master's carpet. Now, by the middle of the 1800s, so the 19th century, as Freemasonry was spreading across America, we see two Ohio companies who become very well known for their fraternal materials. We see the Shearer publications in Cincinnati, which was known for its Masonic degree carpets or trestle boards, and lecture plates. And their creator, John Shearer, produced some very interesting work of early Masonry. In fact, oftentimes what's happening is some of these books that are coming out about Masonry will become the basis of some of the illustrations we have. For example, a single book that comes out in the middle of the early 19th century, give or take, gives us Beautiful Virgin Weeping Over a Broken Column, that monument, and that image of the monument is what follows us all the way into modern day imagery. Now, these items, these trestle boards, are often hung in lodges, and of course we can see them in Ohio and elsewhere. And as I said, they were sometimes woven. Now, as time continues, lodges begin to embrace new technologies. We see companies like MC Lilly & Company from Columbus, Ohio, who become well known for its magic lantern and hand-painted magic lantern glass slides. Some lodges still have these. And they're going to look like a giant slide projector, but you would put a candle in it instead of putting an electric light in it because they don't have electric lighting yet. And the glass slides would frequently be these large glass slides, sometimes 2 by 4 inches, 3 by 5, somewhere in that range. And oftentimes they are hand painted. Sometimes a little bit later, we start to see them as photographic reproduction, basically in a form of daguerreotype. So you can use photography to recreate these and effectively print them on a piece of glass. The images used on those glass plates, created by MC Lilly and inspired by Shearer, eventually find their way onto the photographic slides, film strips, and, well, let's be honest, PowerPoints that we see in use today, at least the traditional forms. Some Grand Lodges put out more modern forms and have started to move away from the original imagery. In the 20th century, the magic lantern, of course, is replaced, but there are a few lodges around that still have the original working model. I can think of a couple of lodges in my area in southeastern Wisconsin that still have the magic lantern, as well as some of the old slide projectors. I know Waukesha still has the glass slides. So they are out there, and it's a fantastic historical source. By the way, in Wisconsin, the old form of the picture lectures is entirely based on the glass slides. They basically scan them in. The newer form moves away from that a little bit. Many older lodges may still have those glass slides, usually sitting in the attic, and oftentimes in a box that's gridded out. So you've got just one slide per slot. And the reason is these slides scratch incredibly easily. If you get a piece of glass and you put the corner of the next piece across the printed side or the painted side, it will scratch it. And so they're often carefully kept, often in a wooden box. And I wouldn't be surprised if you find one in your lodge's attic. In more modern use, finally, while today lodge notices, for example, will be called trestle boards, as the master would be drawing designs for coming work, coming events for the craftsmen. In these notices, it's drawing back to the idea of the original trestle board, of the original instruction, except today when we have the trestle board, our newsletter, it is the instruction from the master to the lodge rather than from the master to the candidate. So today you'll find that many lodges around the world call their members' newsletter or bulletin their trestle board. In former times, a lodge usually had one wooden trestle board, or maybe they drew the tracing board on the floor, showing the symbols for all three working degrees in one board. Waukesha has an example that is paper and fabric. It's fabric-backed paper. These permanent boards eventually are replaced by other forms for each degree, which would be generally smaller and more durable. You can see these at Burlington. You can see these, I think Oconomowoc has a copy. Wilmot used to have a version of them hanging in their lodge room. Several lodges do. And so we go from one massive trestle board to three smaller trestle boards, one for each degree. And these are generally smaller, more durable, but illustrated really the same points and oftentimes in the same style. With three trestle boards, all the important and relevant symbols of each degree could be included in detail, and they are generally done, as we see generally done today. Some of these old trestle boards actually look like window or map, so they look like the old school pull-down maps or old school window shades, where when you pull it down, the first thing you see is the entered apprentice, and then you pull it further and you'll see the fellow craft, and etc. And you'll see those as well, though they don't survive well. Usually they crack off the roller pretty early in their life, but they can be preserved. And this is a great piece of Masonic history. This is a great piece of really who we were. And there's still a brother that I'm aware of, I don't believe he's passed, up at George Washington Lodge, I believe, up in Whitefish Bay, that actually still draws the master's carpet, still draws the one of the degrees. And it's fantastic to see. This is one of those traditions that comes out of old masonry, out of the time when we met secretly. And it's something to keep in mind, because these bits of history are so unique that maybe they could inform something that we do going forward. Maybe it's an informational night. Maybe one night at Lodge, you try drawing it out. Get out a large piece of paper and charcoal and try drawing these images out. And a note on that too. These drawings would not have been as specific as what we see on the current trestle boards, on those permanent painted forms. These would have been oftentimes abstracted, getting across the idea through something simpler. No one's going to draw, for example, a form of a woman to represent fortitude. Instead, they might draw the letter F, or a sword, or any number of other symbols to represent that. Unfortunately, because these symbols were all temporary, we don't have them today. But it would be an interesting Masonic education in your lodge to try something like this. Get a large sheet of paper, lay it out, and see what you can do. And see if you can draw that out. I mean, it's kind of a ancient form of the whiteboard videos that you see on YouTube. It's really a fantastic thing. And the art of it is probably just as phenomenal as the performance of actually drawing it out and then walking a candidate through it. Brothers, there is interesting history in all parts of Masonry. This is our legacy. This is something that we need to carry forward. Remember, it's not always just about education, nor is it about brotherhood, but it is about a legacy that we want to continue on for another generation. Thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Lipke, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.